Howdy everyone. If you're only just getting into politics, but you find yourself clicking on a video like this one, then you probably consider yourself as a liberal. And that might seem intuitive. Politics, in terms of most people's exposure to it at least, is generally a battleground between liberals and conservatives. Most of the people in mainstream politics, up until recently at least with the rising prevalence of fascist coups in America, fall between being liberals and being conservatives, and there's a very clear dichotomy being very strongly presented there. And while all this is true, there's necessarily a slight difference between what liberals believe and the logical endpoint of those progressive ideals that you agree with. But first we have to look at what liberalism is today and where it came from. Liberalism as an idea is hard to talk about concisely in any capacity, but it's impossible to talk about effectively without talking about how it came to be. I will, however, try to keep it as brief as possible. So liberalism, in its broadest sense, came into fruition as we know it during the Enlightenment era in revolutionary France, and its main ideals were based upon liberty, equality, and consent of the governed, which doesn't quite mean democracy, but it includes democracy, as well as a bunch of other esoteric nonsense. And what liberalism entails is different to different people. Some people who consider themselves to be liberal advocate for free market capitalism, lower governmental control, and freedom of press, whereas some take it to mean progressivism, gender and racial equality, and social democracy. This is not to say that these ideals are mutually inclusive nor exclusive, of course, since liberalism is much less of an ideology than a flavor of ideology, more like a novel to be interpreted rather than a science textbook. This means that it's possible for you to call yourself a liberal and still be extremely progressive, and a lot of people do just that. In the modern day, however, liberalism has become entangled with neoliberalism, which is essentially the free market capitalism, lower governmental control interpretation of liberalism. And in common parlance, the two words have essentially become synonymous with one another. And this isn't necessarily contradictory towards progressive ideals, since in the current Western world, progressivism is pretty popular. Neoliberalism is dubbed socially progressive, fiscally conservative by oversimplified political communities for a reason. But neoliberalism is always free market capitalism first, social values second. If bigotry and white nationalism became popular social values, then most neoliberals would adopt them in a heartbeat. And we can see that in action. For example, neoliberalism came into power and prominence under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were hardly socially progressive by any means, to put it bluntly. And while it's certainly possible to think of yourself as pro-capitalism and pro-social progressivism, whether you can actually be both is a different story altogether. There are quite a few people on the left who make the case for something more. And that something more is a scary buzzword you might have heard before but been afraid of thinking about, called socialism. Now, socialism is defined at its core as a democratic meritocracy. In fancy speak, it's the worker-owned ownership of the means of production, where the people who do the work are also the ones who get paid for it, rather than the people who own the companies and shares. It has ties with social democracy, which focuses on taxing the wealthier in our society a little bit more in order to support those less advantaged in society with government programs, as well as syndicalism, which advocates for workplace democracy as a way of meaningfully addressing wealth and income disparity. Now, this is a massive oversimplification, of course. There's a lot more than just that: socialism, syndicalism, and social democracy, and I don't have time to get into all of them. That's honestly just out of the scope for one 6-minute video. But I will dive into all of them later on in this series, so stay tuned for that if you like, and remember to subscribe. But I'll try to make the case for socialism one other way. As famed left-wing philosopher Noam Chomsky said, libertarian socialism, with its emphasis on democracy and equality, is the proper and natural extension of classical liberalism into the era of advanced industrial society. And from this, Chomsky asks us to treat socialism not as an enemy of liberal capitalism, but the natural progression towards the next step in improving society, according to liberal ideals in this advanced industrial world. Just as free market capitalism was the next step from feudalism, such is libertarian socialism the next step from free market capitalism. And hopefully you'll be willing to take that next step with me.